On my hand here is the Sony 35mm F1.4 GM Lens for the E-mount system, and I think this is one of the most impressive 35mm lens I have used so far. I'm Richard and welcome to Zappy Productions, and this is a review of the Sony 35mm F1.4 GM Lens. Now, this will be a more initial look rather than a very full-fledged in-depth review because I only do one photo shoot with it, so there are still some characteristics I have to test in the field itself. Now, this lens is mounted on the A7S III. This is a 12 megapixel camera. So for this review, a lot of the photos are at 200%. And if I was to compare with, let's say, the Canon R5, the R5 will be at 100%, and these camera shots will be at 200%, so that you can get a rough equivalence. Now, the GM 35mm f1.4, as you can see, is really a small lens for a 1.4 lens. And just to compare, this is the 1.8 and f2 lens equivalent. This is the RF 35mm 1.8. And normally, 35mm 1.4s are like twice or three times the size and weight. And that's because usually 1.4 lenses are premium lenses, having premium builds. And normally that comes at the expense of weight and size. But this GM lens is really small, even compared to this. And if you compare to something like the Sigma, whoa, this 40mm Sigma lens, optically perfect, but it's a huge monster. And if you really want to compare again, this is the GF 45mm f2.8, which will translate to about 37mm f2 lens, in full frame terms. And you can see that this lens itself is about the same size as this, but this is a 1.4 and this is a f2 equivalent lens. So Sony did a very good job in terms of making this lens small and light. In terms of weight, this is only 524 grams, less than 2 times the weight of a f2 equivalent lens. This is f1.8, by the way. So still a very good job by Sony, really, because this will probably make it the lightest 35mm 1.4 lens I know so far. All other lenses are about 600, 700, and 800 grams, while this lens is just 524 grams. And weight matters because with a lens like this, you can shoot with one hand and direct your model with the other hand. And that's something you do quite often if you are doing portraiture. Especially say, okay, move your head to the left, move your head to the right, and then you take a shot without actually using two hands on the camera itself. Of course, this is dependent on how stable and your hand is and then how much shutter speed you have. If you have sufficient shutter speed, usually shooting in one hand doesn't have much detrimental effect on the shot itself. Now, the 35mm GM here is a very well-built lens. It's made of plastic and metal together. It's a weather sealed lens, so there is a rubber ring inside. I can't show you. Anyway, the ring is really, really, really small. So I think this is one of the smallest rubber ring I've ever seen, so I'm not really sure sometimes how effective it is. But this lens is quite a well-built lens, so there is an aperture ring. And this aperture ring does have clicks, and you can actually declick it by actually, having this switch here. Let me let you guys hear. So there's a click. Move the switch. No more click. So this function, I believe, is to let you have a very smooth aperture control, especially if you are doing videos, and also to remove that clicky sound, which is very useless for the purpose of video itself. And then it has a focusing ring, and this is a focus by wire lens, so there is not much tactile feeling, just very smooth all around and no hard stops, so not very interesting to talk about. And then the button here, and this button by default is to lock your AF when you're in continuous AF, because by default most people will use continuous AF with the Sony cameras, and this button allows you to lock and do a focus recompose type of technique. And then there's an AF MF button. Oh, by the way, the button can be actually programmed something else, but by default it is that function. Now, this lens have a 67mm filter thread, one of the smaller filter threads for a 1.4 lens you can get in the market. So I have to say, Sony did a good job by keeping the filter thread down and also allowing you to use smaller filters, smaller NDs and whatever. Save you some money on that. Now, other than that, the build quality of this lens is pretty good. I have not much else to say. Light, small, 10cm long, impressive lens in terms of build quality. And this is one of the things that blew me away when I took it out of the box. The box is so small too. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is its usage in the field itself. As I said, the good thing of having a small lens is that you can actually use in the field with one hand with your camera itself. The lens is lighter than the camera, so the weight is actually more back to the camera itself. So it's very nice, comfortable to hold in the field, and you can actually hold quite a prolonged period with one hand without much fatigue. Now, this lens itself is not very big, so as such, it doesn't impede the way you hold. You can still see that there is gap between the finger and the lens, and it doesn't impede your finger going in anything. So quite nice to grip on the camera itself. And then also the buttons, everything, the placement is quite correct because you know when you hold it, everything, you press the buttons here. So everything was really well placed and very usable in the field. One more thing is also the hood, and I think this is one of the best usability thing that Sony thought of, is that this hood itself is a click hood. So it doesn't, you know, spin out of place unnecessarily. Because most other hood I know, you know, really without the click function, it will just spin out like this lens here. And it's quite easy to spin it out really. And the next thing is that Sony did a good job is that firstly there's a felt inside, so it feels premium, but there is a rubber, you know, in the front of the hood itself. And the rubber is very important because you can do this without, you know, being afraid that it will slip off. Of course, if you knock it down, it will drop, but it doesn't slip off. As you can see, it's actually a lot of friction. And this is very common in super telephotos. Most super telephotos I know have some sort of rubber so that they don't slip too. But this is very uncommon for a short lens like this, and I'm really impressed that Sony actually thought of and included this on the hood itself and makes it a lot usable in the field. I mean, putting it like this is quite a common affair, you know. Okay, that's about usability. And the next thing I'll talk about is the autofocus. Now, the autofocus system, I have yet to, I say, extensively test it. I only did one photo shoot with it. I have yet to do a video shoot with it. But I can say that the focus is quite fast. You can take my words for it for now. I have yet to test it with a person running towards me or spinning around, which I usually do. But it is quite fast. I rarely wait for the lens, and it is very quiet. So let me let you guys hear it. So I'm using my shotgun mic here. Now you probably hear more sound from the outside because my wife is watching some video than the lens focusing motor itself. That is how quiet it is. If your mic, or should I say, if my mic, which is the MKH 8060 here, cannot pick up the sound loudly, I think most of the mics they put on top of the camera are not as sensitive. And not only that, you know, they are facing forward rather than towards the camera itself. So probably won't interfere with you when you're doing videos outdoors. And not only that, when you do videos outdoors, you probably have more sound from the environment rather than the camera itself. So that's something that you note. I also noticed that the lens doesn't have sudden jitter sounds and effects. This is quite unlike the Canon one. Canon one, sometimes you can hear the jitter sound, especially for the 50mm lenses. It's very heavy, it moves a lot of glass, but Sony optimized this lens quite well to not have that kind of funny sound. So it does help you a lot in video autofocusing. And that's about it for autofocusing. I will do another review in the future, and I'll talk more about autofocusing when I have chance to have the model subjects spin around and move around to give me a better gauge on how good and how accurate this autofocus is. By the way, the autofocus is very accurate. I have yet to miss a single shot with this camera, so there is no complaint on it. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is image quality, and this is where I think the lens totally shines, because the lens, even though it's small and light, it is optically really, really good. I will just tell you, it's optically fantastic. Sony did give up in one parameter, and I can straight away tell you the parameter is in terms of light transmission, especially at the edges. So this lens have quite a lot of vignetting. In fact, let's take a look at the first shot here. In comparison to the Sigma, now the Sigma is of course a 40mm, so it's slightly zoom in, but you can see the amount of vignetting in this lens. Firstly, the lens is darker than the Sigma 40mm 1.4, and secondly, it has even darker corners than the Sigma 1.4. In fact, the Sigma is 1/3 stop brighter, plus the corners are easily like 1/4 stop brighter than the Sony lens itself. So that's something to note. It does have vignetting, quite a strong vignetting in fact, and it's not as bright as, like say, the Sigma 40mm. Of course, this guy is a monster. And next thing, when it comes to sharpness itself, it is fantastic. I mean, look in the center, it is as sharp as the Sigma. And look at the edges. Now, this is a 12-megapixel camera once again, but if you look really closely, you will notice that the Sigma is a touch hazier. This guy has fantastic, you know, contrast, fantastic sharpness, and personally, even on a 12-megapixel camera, I feel that it is just a slight touch, you know, sharper at the sides than the Sigma itself. Now, maybe it's just the copy variants, or maybe because it has not enough megapixels, so I can't really see too deep into the details itself. But at least when it comes to the contrast at 200%, when it comes to defining outlines at 200%, I just felt that it is just a touch better than the Sigma 40mm, and that is impressive. This Sigma is intense, man. Sigma designed this lens purely for optical performance, and the Sony seems to pie except for vignetting. I mean, the vignetting of this lens and the light transmission is just not as great as the Sigma itself. And then let's look at chromatic aberrations. First, let's look at a night scene here. Look at the light bulbs at the side, and you'll notice that there is no chromatic aberration at the fluorescent tubes. So normally this is where it happens. And in fact, let me show you a comparison shot with the 35mm 1.8 RF lens. You can see the chromatic aberration on the 45 megapixel camera. Of course, there's 45 megapixel, but if I put it at an equivalent magnification, you'll see that this is very noticeable, while this guy is not there at all. And then this lens also have very good chroma control. And if you look at the lights at the left side of the frame now, I move it, you can see that the lights are still round. And by the way, if you don't know what chroma is, let me show you once again with the RF 35mm lens. This is what chroma looks like. It's this flare for lights at the side of the frame, and the GM lens 35mm 1.4 does a fantastic job. Not much chroma, so it is very useful. Probably like astrophotography or something. Next thing, let's look at longitudinal chromatic aberration. So there is this silver plate that I have at home, so just nice I'll be using it. There is a little bit of a longitudinal chromatic aberration. I think that is inevitable, especially for a 1.4 lens. But if you compare it to the Sigma itself, not much difference. The Sigma is of course slightly more controlled, slightly less purple towards the camera, and slightly less green away from the camera, just slightly. But the Sony is doing a relatively good job for it. It's just a slight difference between both of them. But the most noticeable thing, once again, is the illumination. You'll notice that the Sigma has a lot less vignetting, especially at the bottom right-hand corner with the silver plate. You'll notice that. So that is something. Sony gave up vignetting and illumination on this lens, but gave fantastic optics in everything else. And you also can see a little bit of bokeh. The bokeh is relatively smooth, if you ask me. So I think this lens does a pretty good job in that. So this is so much for synthetic test. Let's show you a real world shot. So this is the setting of the shot itself. It's LED lights with a very brightly lit window. In fact, the window is, I think, 3 stops or 4 stops brighter than the person's face. So this is where normally chromatic aberrations happen. And in this shot, I will show you how the chromatic aberration looks like. Now, the shot is processed, so do not ask whether is it unprocessed or not. It is processed, but the only thing that's not processed is the eyes itself. So the eyes is very sharp, but if not, the skin is processed. So just take a look at its chromatic aberration mainly. So the chromatic aberration of this shot itself, you'll notice that there is some CA on the hair, the hand. Not that bad, not that intrusive overall, but it is there. So it is not the most corrected 35mm lens I know. In fact, the most corrected one I know is this 45mm GF, which is the 37 F2 equivalent. This lens has literally no chromatic aberration. I have shot many times with these settings, and with the GF lens, I always have maximum satisfaction. No chromatic aberration at all. And with the Sigma lens, there is still some now and then, but definitely lesser than the Sony. But overall, I think that the Sony still did a very good job. It is very minimal. But once again, just note that this is a 12 megapixel camera. So if you are using something of a higher megapixel, like say the A7R4 or the A1, you will definitely see more chromatic aberration, especially because you can zoom in further. But then again, once again, if you are looking at the photo as a whole itself, it is non-intrusive. And if you zoom in 200% equivalent, which is a 45 megapixel at 100%, you will not notice much chromatic aberration with the Sony lens 35mm 1.4 GM. So in terms of image quality, I would say as this lens is fantastic. It has very good chroma control, very good chromatic aberration control for a 1.4. It is very, very sharp all the way to the corner. As such, you can use it anywhere in the frame. And the only thing it gives up is that its vignetting is a bit strong and its illumination is not as great. But if you ask me, it is a very good performing lens. Consider its size and weight. 524 grams, 10 cm long, 67mm filter thread. I mean, this is like fantastic, man. You get such a perfect lens in such a small package, unless you want to take the Sigma 40mm here. This is a perfect lens, just monstrous in size. 3 times the weight. And not only that, the price is actually really good. I mean, this price, the lens price, I believe is 1,400 USD, or in Singapore, it's about 1,900 Sing dollars in street value. So the GM 35mm 1.4 is a very impressive lens overall. For its price, for its size, for its quality, I really can't complain anymore. Now, if Sony made these $500 more expensive, I would have expected a lot more, especially in terms of its vignetting and its chromatic aberration. I would have expected a lot more because, the price of this is just low enough that I really cannot complain. I mean, for a first-party lens, it is more expensive than the Sigma 35mm 1.4, but it is so sharp, so good, and if you ask me, relatively on par with the Sigma 1.4 40mm. So I really don't have complaints considering the size itself. This is like the smallest 35mm. I'm willing to trade a little bit of image quality for the size, but the this lens has no trade-off other than vignetting, but with a modern camera like the A7S III or the A7R4 or the A1, that few stops of illumination can be easily recovered for the corners, unless you are very particular about corner illumination. But if not, if you are looking at a general frame and if you stop down this lens, you will easily get back most of the illumination itself. I don't think there's a problem using this lens in most use cases. That's about it for today. I really enjoyed using the Sony 35mm F1.4 GM lens. This is in fact the first time I felt really pleased with a Sony lens itself. I got the 20mm 1.8. I think that's a fantastic lens too. But the 35mm 1.4 is just one step ahead of it. It is just so nice to use when I first got it and take it out of the box. Small, light 1.4, impressive optics. That's about it for today. I hope you enjoyed this review. Do like and subscribe if you want to have more reviews in the future. And as I said, I bought this Sony camera so that I could do shoots at 12 megapixel and also to do reviews on Sony equipment. And I'll definitely do more in the future. So I hope you enjoy this and I will see you next time. Bye bye.